Oh shit. Oh my god. Oh fuck off. Oh fuck.
The deep thump of a resonating double bass string broke through Evan's mental fog. Years of playing on stage with his trio had engraved this sound deep into his mind and made it instantly recognizable. Turning slowly, Evan cast a sideways glance at the slender shape of a man plucking away at the instrument standing on stage left. His fingers slapped up and down the neck as the deep notes reverberated through Evan's body in small yet impactful bursts. Whoever this man was, he managed to deliver notes and calming plucks that forced Evan to consider dropping his current bassist. And he gave him a wink before once again becoming lost in the soft rhythm. "What?" Evan muttered under his breath while turning back to the piano placed in front of him. Despite the lounge looking no different from the various others he had performed in so many times throughout his life, Evan could sense an unidentified characteristic that made the space seem ever so slightly off-kilter. The more reasonable explanation he could conjure was that he had consumed too many drinks before taking the stage. This had occurred more times than he was proud to admit, but he found comfort in at least being able to admit what a mess his life had down-spiraled into. The bass rhythm gave Evan the expression of drawing to an end, and he felt his fingers slide on top of the ivory piano keys. Pressing them down, he let his mind slip away while they danced across the instrument with ease and fluidity. Any sort of estimate on how long Evan played his own improvised set were of no concern. The pianist let himself linger on the ivory until the piano strings ceased their vibration. His fingers let up, and an applause began from across the room. Standing up from the severely slouched position he had craned his neck into, Evan shyly nodded and accepted the appreciation. Although every club he had played in was a vast majority of unknown faces, there were always some recognizable individuals. However, Evan was unable to pinpoint a single member of the audience. Turning to his trio mates, he flashed each of them a light smile. Although their names had still failed to return to memory, Evan motioned for them to take a brief intermission. The applause died down and gave way to chairs being pushed back as the audience began their pilgrimage to the bar for another round. As the crowd dispersed, Evan fished around in his pocket for a pack of cigarettes, feeling the worn cardboard box against his fingertips. He pulled it out and shook the package towards his fellow musicians. "Either of you care for one?" They both waved their hands in appreciation of the gesture, before immediately turning in the direction of the bar. As the drummer and bassist joined the human conglomeration that had almost fully obscured Evan's view of the bar, he shrugged and approached the stairs which led off stage. "Suit yourselves." His lanky figure crossed the lounge floor with bounding steps, while weaving between tables and throwing occasional smiles in the direction of a few guests. He pulled out one of the off-white cigarettes from his pack. Approaching the dark mahogany door that he had no memory of entering through, Evan leaned against it and pushed the door open with his back. As soon as a crack formed between it and the door jamb, a rush of freezing air shot through the gap. Evan let out a stuttering breath as the bitter cold ripped against his skin. The door squeaked on its hinges before closing with a thud as he squeezed through the opening. As he pulled the lighter from his chest pocket and flicked the cap open with a metallic clank, the realization dawned on him that his jacket was likely still inside. He shrugged and found the effort of going back inside to search for it to be outweighed by his craving for tobacco. Evan rolled down the sleeves of his somewhat baggy white dress shirt as a weak attempt to further fight the cold. Taking in a deep breath, he felt the familiar warm comfort of smoke trickle down his throat. An effort had been made, quite some time ago, to kick the habit since his wife was appalled by the stench, but it was hardly a concern to him anymore. While his mind slowly relinquished its brutal grasp out of desire for a cigarette, Evan studied the environment around the lounge. Besides the weathered brick of the exterior, he was surprised to find no neighboring structure on either side, spare a parking lot. He took a drag and diverted his attention from the cars. As smoke escaped the side of his mouth in a thin stream, Evan studied a thicket of tall, looming trees standing off in the distance. They swayed gently in the light breeze while Evan swore he could hear extremely faint footsteps from deep within the timbers. He squinted his eyes and focused on the perimeter where the forest met snow. Something could be seen slowly moving within the forest, but Evan was unable to distinguish it more than a blur. No longer wishing to pay attention to the woods, he turned to the side once more to find a small grouping of cars peeking just around one corner of the building. Every other patch of ground had been blanketed by a light layer of snow. Much to his dismay, Evan looked up to find a few flakes floating down. Why he had not noticed them before was hardly given a thought, as he noticed the snow being bathed in a soft red glow. Pivoting his head to discover the source, Evan took another drag as the cigarette burned closer and closer to the filter. The Black Forest. The neon sign buzzed over the doorway as Evan stared up with the block lettering reflecting in his glasses. He could not recall entering this lounge in the first place, let alone ever hearing of its existence. He assumed it was another small show his manager had booked without a smidgen of research on the venue. Not a really inviting name, but it's quite fitting. A voice chimed in. Evan sucked in a sharp breath before turning in the direction of the voice. His gaze landed on a man leaning against the brickwork, just outside the reach of the sign's buzzing crimson glow. The stranger lifted a lighter to his face and cupped a hand around the flame. As the end of a cigarette burned in the night, he flicked the lid shut and turned to Evan. People don't usually come outside. Evan was unable to find an appropriate response for this man's sudden appearance. He eventually snapped from the trance, only to stumble over the beginning of a sentence. I just needed a smoke. The man smiled warmly before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a pack of cigarettes. I have to give credit where credit is due. Many groups of musicians have come through here, but yours is probably my favorite, Evan. Upon closer inspection, Evan could easily make out the camel logo on the packaging. He quickly felt around his pants pocket to find his own pack missing. Before he had the chance to give the stranger a piece of his mind, the cigarettes went sailing through the air. Evan caught them and looked dumbfoundedly between his hand and this man. Even though you and I have each had one, I can assure you, the pack is still full. Evan glared at the man before popping the lid. Sure enough, he was greeted with a sight of 20 orange filters staring up at him. A word of advice, Evan let out with an obvious tone of aggravation. If you want to successfully beg people for money after some magic trick, well, at least go beyond just pickpocketing me and pretending to steal one of those cigarettes. After one final puff, Evan flicked his burnt filter off into the distance before reaching for the door handle. Just as his fingers wrapped around the cold steel, the man's voice spoke up and caused Evan to freeze in his tracks. You want to know how you got here, or not? Silence hung in the air. A small disturbance came from a gentle breeze whistling past both men. This light chill hardly bothered Evan, as he tried to figure out how this individual had seemed to read his exact thoughts. I know you want to go back inside and hope that a little fresh air will have unblocked whatever is clogging your mind right now. Evan's fingers slowly released the door handle. His gaze remained locked on this man as he waited for him to continue. Keep this in mind, the stranger spoke with an unnerving calmness. I'm the only thing here that can answer your questions. What's your name? Evan asked rather bluntly. Don't really have one. But someone nicknamed me Ronnie some time ago, so let's go with that. Evan smirked and raised an eyebrow. Well, all right, Ronnie. Would you care to tell me where I am? I've performed at countless clubs over the years. This one doesn't seem familiar in the slightest. Well, it's because it doesn't really exist. You're in purgatory. The blunt fashion in which Ronnie delivered the last sentence made Evan doubt him tremendously. He felt the desire to let out a mocking laugh, but found Ronnie undeserving of the effort. Yeah, that's cute, Ronnie. That's really cute. We almost done here? Well, you're not the first to give that response, and you'll hardly be the last. Ronnie replied with a chuckle. He took a drag on the cigarette, and Evan swore that no ash had accumulated on the end, despite him taking numerous puffs from the thing. It seems like every year, fewer and fewer people come through here that still hold religious beliefs. It's not a personal attack on them in the slightest. You see, it just makes my job a little more difficult, and they're less and less likely to accept the truth when I deliver it. Listen, Ronnie, I actually am religious. Catholic. I have been since I was a kid. Even given that, I'm still having major trouble believing what you're preaching. Ronnie emitted a light laugh and shot Evan a playful smile. Well, there's no need to keep secrets from me. I know you haven't worn your cross necklace since Linda passed. It's just been sitting in your top dresser drawer gathering dust with the cufflinks from your brother's wedding. Why, you fucking piece of shit. Evan darted from the door in Ronnie's direction. Just as he was about to be within range to grab the man by his collar and smash his head into the brick wall, the neon signs stopped buzzing. They were thrown into an inky blackness, and Evan immediately lost his orientation. He stumbled for a moment as his feet clumsily crunched in the snow before finding balance with a hand against the brickwork. The sign revived itself, and the snow-covered ground was once again illuminated from the sign's vibrancy. Ronnie now stood completely opposite of Evan, by the door that entered the lounge. Well, I can promise you that I'm not upset by that gesture, he let out calmly while holding up his hands. Let me just once again remind you that the less you and I butt heads, quicker and smoother this will all work out. Do we have an understanding? The men stood in silence while Evan stared on with a completely blank expression. Eventually, he wiped a few snowflakes from his glasses with the back of a shirt sleeve. You claim this was purgatory, so why don't you go ahead and prove your point to me? Evan asked without even bothering to justify the previous question with a response. Well, that definitely cuts out a lot of the pointless back and forth I've gotten used to. Without another word, Ronnie turned and began walking towards the corner of the building. He waved a hand, and Evan slowly began trailing behind him. As they neared the parked cars that Evan had noticed earlier, he gazed behind him to notice the absence of footprints in the snow. What had started as a thin top coat on the dead grass had accumulated tremendously to create a thick base. Their feet crunched through the powder, and Evan studied the ground closer. Each impression in the snow was almost immediately filled back in by a small flurry of flakes. You drive the beige Studebaker, correct? Ronnie stopped mid-step to point aimlessly into the grouping of automobiles. As Evan stopped by his side to gaze over the parking lot illuminated by a few flickering overhead lights, His eyes scanned for the familiar sight of his car. She doesn't exactly stick out like a sore thumb there, Ronnie. My apologies. Does this help? With a snap of his fingers, all but one of the lights was extinguished. Every car vanished into the darkness except for one. The beige Studebaker sat sturdy and strong in the snow, despite the years of usage and neglected maintenance. With only one light bulb left burning, the harmony of buzzing bulbs had been replaced by a singular, haunting hum above Evan's car. You're starting to earn my trust more and more there, Ronnie. As the men approached the vehicle, Evan cast a quick glance towards the forest. He swore something had made a light brushing sound from the foliage, but the sound ceased almost immediately. If you want to be further impressed, I know about the dent on the hood. I believe it has a speck or two of your dried blood that has yet to wear off. Now that's not criticism against you, however. The reason behind the outburst was more than warranted. Sure enough, the dent was visible on the hood with a couple of brown spots where the blood had long since dried up. Evan turned to Ronnie one final time. The expression of skepticism that had plagued his face ever since meeting this man had finally subdued. He put one foot forward and once again heard the familiar crunch of snow under his shoe. Evan took slow and steady steps towards the vehicle before coming to a stop. The glossy black tips of his shoes rested just outside the halo of light which encompassed the car. Evan could still clearly remember the day he had received that dreaded phone call at work. Linda had been found dead in their living room when the neighbor went to drop off a get-well-soon card and gift basket. He saw her body through the window and broke open the door in a fruitless attempt at keeping her clinging to life. The cancer had been discovered in the late stages, but Evan had still been told his wife had at least a couple of months left. Only a week had passed, and he soon found himself in his office parking lot, banging on the car's hood with a blinding rage. He only stopped his assault on the vehicle after leaving his fist a bloodied mess with 3 shattered fingers. Playing the piano now only occurred with a slightly dragging hand, but he considered himself lucky he had not completely destroyed his ability to play the instrument. As Evan slowly turned and attempted to find where his neighbor's son had dented the driver's side door with a fouled baseball, he froze. His demeanor remained impassive while unblinking eyes gazed into the car. Though the windshield was heavily obscured by a layer of snow, Evan was sure that he could make out something resting behind the steering wheel. Turning to Ronnie, his breath escaped through his lips in a faint cloud. He stared into the man's eyes without uttering a word, but that hardly stopped Ronnie from reading exactly what was racing through his mind. You've known for quite some time that you would end up leaving life behind. The only real question you had was, when? There was silence. Take a closer look, Evan. Without uttering anything, Evan's head pivoted back to the car. He took slow and hesitant footsteps towards the door. Upon his initial inspection, he had failed to realize the slight gap left in the driver's side window. A thought burned in the back of his mind that Evan knew was correct, but failed to acknowledge. He leaned forward and wiped the fogged window with the sleeve of his dress shirt. Evan's own pale and sunken face stared back at him through the glass with soulless eyes. Now, you always knew it would end this way, Evan. Thought of a cocaine overdose was something you kept shoved away in the back of your mind so it wouldn't bother you. Well, I do completely understand. If I was in your predicament, I'd also want to quash anything that threatened my only escape from a painful life. Evan had completely lost feelings in his fingertips by this point, as he stared with unblinking horror at the soft blue skin of his own face, with eyes rolled up deep within their sockets. Every word that Ronnie spoke came through as muffled echoes. His body sat crooked in the car seat, with a greasy mop of unkempt hair pressed against the window. Foam leaked from the corners of his mouth, with a trail of vomit and bile slowly running down his shirt. Snow floated through the crack in the window and had begun to create a light film on his corpse. The point was fast approaching on the horizon where you would attempt a high that your physical form could no longer take. Of course, I knew it would happen tonight, but no one else on Earth did. It happened right before the show, didn't it? Ronnie sighed while taking a quick glance at the vehicle. Well, I'm afraid so. Right now, back on Earth, your bandmates are coming out of the back door of the lounge, trying to search for you. It won't be long now until they find your car and the inevitable tragedy that you became. They won't be too surprised that it finally happened, but that won't help relieve the pain. Evan had not looked back to Ronnie since approaching the car. His gaze remained locked on the body in the driver's seat. The wedding ring he had refused to take off after his wife's passing glistened under the overhead streetlight. While staring back at the tarnished gold band, Evan could suddenly sense its absence on his own fingers as he brushed them past each other. He raised his hand to see a faint tan line. Do you mind if I take it back? Ronnie had no need to even follow the direction Evan's outstretched finger was pointing. I did have a feeling you would notice the ring. If it helps you bring some form of closure, then by all means, take it. Evan reached back towards the car to retrieve the ring, but paused mid-reach to find the golden loop suddenly shimmering on his own finger underneath the light. He inspected it with a smile pulling at the corner of his lips for the first time in recent memory. Just promise me that it won't let it consume you. The faint shimmer of happiness disappeared in an instant as Evan turned back to Ronnie. He gave the man a slightly puzzled look while rubbing the ring against his fingers. Consume me? Ronnie shrugged and gave a light chuckle. Well, that seems like a rather asinine thing to say, I must admit. But there's a reason the Black Forest exists. Just let me explain. He turned on his heels and began in the direction of the tree line. Evan took the cue and jogged at a light pace until the two men walked side by side. Well, I can't exactly recall the time when the Black Forest didn't stand in this field, but I knew that such an era does exist. The structure's appearance may change, but it still serves the same purpose for every man, woman, and child. Some just require it more than others. But I'm still lost. What exactly is this place doing here? As Evan turned over his shoulder to steal a glance at the building, he noticed that the parking lot had disappeared into thin air. What sat in its place was a snow-covered field, glistening under the bluish light of the moon. Well, for example, you've noticed that the parking lot is no longer there. It served its purpose, so there's no need to keep it around anymore. What makes the Black Forest different is that pretty much everyone requires it until they've received their final judgment. It takes on the atmosphere of whatever makes someone comfortable. In that case, well, I find it a bit strange that it turned into a nightclub. They aren't exactly known for being comforting. Ronnie raised a finger before countering Evan's point. Well, you may think that at first, but I've gotten to understand you just as well as you can understand yourself. So, let me ask you, Evan, what do you think you would have made for a more consoling environment? Call it be the house where you can hardly pass by the living room where Linda died without breaking out into tears? Possibly. We could also consider the ski lodge you visited in Colorado. Well, I've seen that memory played so many times over, and it's one of the happiest points in your life. However, That was a trip to try and forget about Linda's miscarriage. So, depression hung in the air, no matter how much he tried to push it away. Ronnie paused and momentarily turned his attention to a dead silent Evan. You see, out of all the places in your life, I'd never seen you more withdrawn from your issues than in a nightclub. Out of all the moments I viewed within your life, you never appeared happier than seated behind a piano with an audience giving thunderous applause. That's why I decided the Black Forest should take on its current form. Crunching of their feet in the snow stopped. Evan snapped out of his trance to find himself staring into the infinite thicket of trees. Now, I've told you earlier to not let that ring consume you. Ronnie let out in a hauntingly neutral tone. So far, you've done an exceptional job, which leads me to believe that I may have misjudged what exactly would be your final confrontation. The snap of a branch echoed through the air. If I was a betting man, I would have lost. It appears something far stronger still has its hold on you. From an almost inky blackness between the thick trunks, Evan could make out a shape approaching. This mysterious being hobbled and traveled in a crooked and shifted manner. With each step it took, the blurriness from before resolved itself into the outline of an animal. The Black Forest may give the soul a place to rest, but there's a final judgment everyone must undergo. What stood before Evan left his mouth hanging slightly open. A contorted body similar to that of a deer stood on quaking legs that could collapse at any moment. There was no trace of fur, instead replaced by a black layer of skin that was marred with abrasions and exposed wounds of sickly gray flesh. The entire beast glistened under the moonlight, as Evan could make out a film over its hide. This monstrosity gave off a smell of rot and decay that only seemed possible from extreme states of decomposition. There's a reason some are able to return to the Black Forest, while others never cross its threshold again. You see, it all pivots on your own decision, but don't let the simplicity of that statement misguide you. Evan could feel his arms trembling, but he was unable to break eye contact with this beast. He continued to stare into its hollow eye sockets that somehow emitted a hellish red glow. And suddenly, there was a sickening crack and a gut-churning sound of skin tearing open. His eyes darted down the creature's neck to find the hide beginning to separate. A gray, semi-translucent fluid seeped from the edges of the opening and fell to the forest floor in sickening globs. As the fluid began to vacate the cavity, Evan could make out a human face behind the shimmer of gray liquid. It appeared blissful. As Evan found himself wanting to turn his head away, he could not help but notice how the individual inside seemed completely unaware of what encapsulated him. His face became clearer, leading to the discovery of bloated cheeks, blotches of red skin, and a nose tip with disgustingly obvious veins. It reminded him of the face his own father had developed after nearly a decade of falling asleep with the drained liquor bottle tangled in his fingers. Everyone has that one sin that's harder to resolve than all the others. For some, their most difficult is still relatively easy to overcome. For others, however, it becomes one of their few or only known means of achieving bliss. The face within the beast released a stench that made Evan's nostrils burn, as if he had just inhaled vapors from the opening of a vodka bottle. It happens more often than I desire, but for some, it's become their only source of escape from their unbearable lives. This situation is sometimes of their own negligent creation, and nothing more than a cheap thrill, but the majority of souls I come across are simply a victim of their own circumstance. I can never blame them for returning to the only comfort they've come to know. A gust of hot air blew against the back of Evan's neck and sounded as if it had been exhaled from nostrils. He shot around to find another one of these beasts standing behind him. Its body stood just as broken and misshapen as the other. Before Evan could study it closely, the sound of tearing skin filled the air once more. As the familiar sight of gray fluid spilled from the gash, he was somewhat surprised to not find another face staring back at him. Instead, a soft white glow emanated from deep within. It's beautiful. Evan's arm mindlessly began to lift from his side. He leaned in slowly, with fingertips beginning to lose the numbness brought on by the harsh bite of the bitter cold. A pin of red appeared in the middle of his forearm that caused a momentary prick before simply subsiding. With every inch he drew closer to the light, Evan could feel a warm sensation traveling up his veins. The all too familiar rush of injection began to fill his body. It evicted the cold that he had only just now realized had penetrated deep to his core and left his body feeling like a stone. The unexpected yet welcome sensation of euphoria began to cloud Evan's mind. His eyes rolled back into his head, and his mouth pulled up into a smile. Just as he was about to become fully enveloped in this cloud of bliss, something caught his attention. From just outside the blinding white glare came something else. A flash of vibrant gold interrupted the experience from the corner of his vision. He was unable to relinquish himself from the state of nirvana, but mindlessly flailed his fingers to try and contact the source of his distraction. Evan suddenly brushed against something and felt his wedding band spin on his finger. The smile on Evan's face began to droop, and his body tensed up again. Eternal bliss faded away, and the corner of Evan's vision returned to normalcy. The white cloud vanished, and the blurred shape of the trees vignetted his vision. The warm sensation fled his veins. But Evan was unable to feel a hollow cold in the absence of his narcotic savior for the first time. He collapsed to the ground. His first impressions of ascending to a higher plane of pleasure had been replaced by the realization of almost being trapped in a false sense of closure. He reached behind his head and wiped snow from his hair before sitting up. The beast had begun walking away with cumbersome steps. Evan stood up and continued to watch as it crossed the field. Unlike Ronnie and himself, the footprints this thing left were not filled in by snow. The small prints led away in a stumbling pattern. Eventually, it returned to the forest from which it had emerged. The gentle snap of branches subsided and signaled its full retreat from Evan. I had my doubts originally. Ronnie smiled in Evan's direction. He had pulled out another cigarette and let a thin trail of smoke fade out into the air. You see, the last man in a predicament similar to yours ended up letting his wife pull him inside. Well, I was almost sure she would be your final confrontation. But I suppose I misjudged you, Evan. A small cloud of smoke billowed into the air. Evan inhaled the familiar smell of nicotine, but felt no desire to retrieve the pack of cigarettes from his pocket. I'm just glad you proved me wrong. He slowly turned back towards the black forest, with a light breeze picking up the tail of his coat. Before Evan could begin to follow suit, his attention was caught by the glimmer of something in the moonlight. He glanced down at the ground to find the top of a needle staring up at him from the snow, before being covered by a layer of flakes. For the first time in years, Evan was able to gaze upon a needle without feeling a burning desire to stick it beneath his skin. The two men proceeded towards the welcoming glow of the neon sign. Ronnie opened the handle with a creak and held it open. Evan proceeded inside and flashed the man a light smile before shaking loose the snow that had accumulated in his hair. The trio currently performing on stage had just come to the end of their set. causing a sound of applause that echoed throughout the room. As the musicians took a bow, they glanced around the room and nodded lightly. When the pianist locked eyes with Evan, the smile increased. He made a swooping gesture with his arm over the piano bench and slowly backed away from the instrument. "I'll let you know when it's time to go upstairs," Ronnie spoke with pride in his tone. "But for now, enjoy yourself. I think you've earned it." Ronnie gave him a pat on the shoulder before proceeding towards the bar near the back of the room. Evan let out a long breath before proceeding towards the stage. The applause gradually died down until all that resonated in Evan's ears were his own footsteps proceeding up the stage entrance. As he made his way across the stage, the other musicians took their places. Evan sat down before the wide range of keys. He let one hand glide over the polished ivory and soon realized fingers on his right hand were no longer bent at incorrect angles. Well, I'll be damned. With one final look at the audience, he pressed down on the piano. From outside his field of vision, a brass section came to life, along with a thump from the double bass and the gentle brushing on the drum kit. The fast pace of jazz pieces he had become accustomed to had given way to a swaying beat that had not been on his mind in many years. Although familiar to Evan, he was unable to pinpoint exactly why he was able to play this song with a level of repetition that hinted to hundreds of performances. We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when. Evan turned to find someone had sat next to him on the bench, and for the first time in years, Linda's beaming smile filled Evan's soul with unsurpassable joy. He could feel tears welling in the corners of his eyes as the sound of horns played in the background. "But I know we'll meet again some sunny day," she sang in the same divine tone that Evan had missed since the day that she had left. Linda reached out and caressed Evan's cheek before fixing the one lock of his hair that always managed to fall away from the rest. As she leaned closer, Evan now found himself swinging along with her. A few hot tears rolled down his face, and Evan felt no desire to wipe them away. "Keep smiling through, just like you always do, till the blue skies drive the dark clouds far away." Linda inched closer to Evan on the bench and rested her head on his shoulder. As his fingers continued to glide over the keys, he no longer felt the same escape from reality that had paired itself to his performances for all of those years. What filled him now was a sense of comfort and wholeness that had been ripped from his soul when Linda passed. As she sat up straight once more, Linda placed a kiss on his cheek and let out a light laugh. Evan responded with the same gesture as the audience filled the room, with a singular voice. "So will you please say hello to the folks that I know? Tell them it won't be long. They'll be happy to know that as you saw me go, I was singing the song. We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day." Introduction. The town of Hollow Roots is the sort of place that you enter, flee, and somehow end up returning to despite a lifelong promise to never go back. It has an unfortunate reputation amongst a lot of people as a death sentence. But if you're going to someone's house to audit them, you need to be aware of threats no matter the nature. Everyone here who does audits will have had guns, knives, and much more pointed at them. It's no different with Hallow Roots, except that the things pointed at you will be a lot stranger. But Hallow Roots is also kind of heartening. Like I've said to many other employees here, plenty of people live long lives there, and a shocking number of them just adapt to the weirdness. It's nice to see what people can just get over with enough time. Still, none of you young folk want to hear about that. You want to know about all the gory details. I've worked for a long time at the IRS, and I've had my fair share of crazy stories, but people only want to know about my experiences at the specific town. Maybe it was the way Annie Davies came back after trying to audit Intra Incorporated. Or maybe it's the fact that most of you have snuck a peek at how much the DoD is paying Intra Incorporated for a secrecy clause. I'd like to remind you, by the way, that doing so is a federal crime. But still, I'm not here to chide you. Hallow Roots is a poorly kept secret. But when I finally retire, I'd like you to have an understanding of what Hallow Roots truly is. First thing you might want to know is that yes, I lost my eye because of Hallow Roots. But you might not also know that I lost 1 kidney, 3 meters of intestine, and 1/3 of my liver because of it as well. You might also want to know that you'll never find it in the same place twice. First time I drove there, it took me 8 damn days going in a straight line. It was a pretty torturous journey. Some of the diners on the way hurt my head to think about. Hell, I'm pretty sure one of them had pictures of an old JFK shaking Thatcher's hand. Another had an American flag with just 13 large stars on it. One place I went to had a plaque commemorating John Wilkes Booth. You want to know what's really scary? Weren't nowhere near Hallow Roots when I saw that. Oh well. It's still important that you know that in Hallow Roots time doesn't really flow in any one direction. Be prepared to mention a name in passing, like Bush or Cheney, and have the locals look at you like a simpleton. What else is important? Well, you won't hear the same story each time when you ask around. I remember a pretty quaint little place, but Alec from down the hall made it out to be a bustling town with a moderate population. Annie Davies, back before she needed that laptop to speak, called it a frozen shithole, though she always did seem to come back with a wonderful tan. Most people, though, tend to remember the same key details. For one, Hallow Roots will always give you a scar no matter what happens. You could stand on the border and put your little pinky toe across the line and something, somehow, will happen to give you at least some kind of permanent reminder that you've been there. Second thing is, the people there are shockingly nonchalant about their lives. Alec told me once he hit a kid, and his mother was furious that the boy wouldn't be able to take the garbage out on account of his feet pointing the wrong way. Similarly, when I drove into town, I watched a funeral where everyone was laughing and jostling each other. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But later that day, I found out it was the funeral of a kid aged 9, maybe 10. There's loads of other quirks. It's just not easy to list them all. Thing is, no matter how weird or how different it can be, we all know that it's the same place. It's just presented itself a little differently each time is all. For me, it was a dry little southern town. I remembered tumbleweeds rolling out of the alleyways and across the road, and old folks sat on porches with pipes and cigars. I saw banjos and spitting jars for tobacco, and old fat women with missing teeth. It seemed kind of nice, actually, because it was a bit like where I grew up. I felt strangely happy strolling up to the small little inn in the center of town and asking for a room. I guess I'm telling you all this because it's important to let you know that it might not meet your ghoulish expectations straight away. You ain't gonna rock up and see Dracula chasing villagers. In fact, it might make you feel at home. Just don't let your guard down. Oh, and Alec gave me a bit of advice. He reckons that some of the inns are safe places for strangers, but not all of them. It's a good thing to ask if the innkeepers are staying in the same place, because they'll avoid somewhere that's likely to lose a couple of guests each night. You're gonna want to remember that one. Oh, that's right. I didn't say, did I? You'll be taking over the Hallow Roots accounts. I know you'll likely have plenty of reservations. And you're right. You should. I ain't lying when I say that you won't see Dracula chasing villagers, but you won't come back the same from that town either. You get yourself ready and prepared, and with a little bit of common sense, you might even find it fun. The thing you have that I never had is some useful advice, so heed all I've said till now, because it's going to be necessary to staying alive. There isn't a list of things I can tell you to do or not to do, but all throughout my life I've collected stories from that place. Every time I had to go there, I took the time out to make sure I left with a new story. Some are first-hand accounts. Some are more complicated. But still, each one of them will tell you something about the place and hopefully keep you on your toes. Value these stories. And value mine too, because mine is in there as well. Read them. Hold on to them. And don't forget what they teach you. Vernian Marble. You've heard of Intra Incorporated, right? Everyone has. What you might not know is that Hallow Roots has had a richer industrial history than you might expect. I found the remnants of one company in some books no one had touched since 1932, and I thought that if I could get back taxes on this Roxwell Mining Corporation, then I'd get my boss's attention. But then it was all about kicking down doors and kicking ass, and there was a lot of unbridled ambition. Roxwell was my introduction to Hallow Roots. It was why I went there. I shouldn't have left without some help, but I didn't want to share the glory either. It took a while to find the place on a map, but I finally took off from the west coast on the 15th of May, and eventually found the right place on the 23rd of May. And yes, I drove in a straight line. It was disorienting and kind of confusing. When I finally arrived, and I decided to skip the first inn I arrived in, since there was some poor guy collapsing down the road from it, with a finger missing and blood pouring out everywhere. I did take a moment out to try and help, but he just pointed at a handkerchief in his top pocket, so I took it out and, it just kept coming. It was the longest damn handkerchief I've ever seen, and it was all sorts of colors, but he just snatched it up from me and started wrapping it around his bloodied fist. No matter what I said to him, he wouldn't look at me, so in the end, I gave up and just kept going. Luckily, I didn't need to stop in the town itself. I just kept going along the through road towards the home of Roxwell Mining Company that lay somewhere along the easterly region. You have to appreciate that, because I hadn't paid much attention as I drove along, that everything that happened in Roxwell totally rewrote my understanding of the world. It was unreal. The first thing I noticed was the place was in ruins. The building would have been shoddy looking in its prime, and it sat in the middle of nowhere. In particular, it seemed to sit in the middle of some flat, long-reaching fields, which had filled with wheat and corn. I'd only found records of this one particular mine, and it seemed real busy, so it must have been doing something despite the location and lack of mountains. As far as I can tell, somewhere between the buildings and warehouses, the mine itself must have been hidden away. Still, it was clear as day that the place was abandoned, so I remained in my car parked up on the side of the road for some time while I wondered what to do. Part of me wanted to call it a day and leave, but I'd invested a lot of my time by this point, so I decided to be brave and enter. There was a lot of piled up corrugated iron by the fence, and the overgrown bushes let me know it'd simply been empty for a long time. When I noticed all the doors were locked, and that they were far too heavy for someone like me to kick down, I kept on looking until I found some iron rungs that formed a ladder on one of the walls. A little pressure revealed them to be reasonably stable. What can I say? I was young and a little bit adventurous. I climbed them, and I wound up on the roof of the first building. The metal beneath my feet felt pretty unstable, so I was really careful as I inched across the rusted ceiling towards a small hatch that was left open. At first, I was just going to look down into a room below, but by the time I'd clocked an old-timey typewriter and an office chair covered in cobwebs, I began to hear some creaking and fell straight through one of the panels. It was a painful fall, but thankfully, I landed on a large desk which collapsed when I hit it. I think it helped me break my fall enough to stop me from breaking any bones, though I'd still been scratched up pretty bad on the way down. You know when you're bleeding, but the dust cakes the wound away? And it itches like hell, and it stings like a bitch? The palms of my hands and most of my right shoulder felt like that. I stood up and coughed out a lungful of dust and gripped my arm while trying to ignore just how much it had fucking hurt. Looking around, I saw the usual 50s office, but it was hidden away in this kind of sepia darkness. The window to the right of the desk was cracked and let a lot of amber-tinted light through, but not enough to make the place feel safe. Once I'd let my eyes adjust, I limped up to the desk and noticed that the typewriter still had paper in the tray, and once I'd yanked it free, I saw a memo half-typed. All administration staff are instructed to not discuss work details with our competitors, especially intra. And then it stopped. I looked and saw that across from the typewriter were a pair of post-war style woman's glasses with a smashed lens. It was clearly the receptionist desk, as it faced the entrance and had its back to a long hallway that led to the facility itself. It was much darker the further the hall went, but I still managed to see one lone little woman's red shoe some distance away. I limped away from the dusty desk toward the shoe. Shuffling past the cracked window, I looked out towards the distant road where my car remained parked, and reminded myself that despite the dark and abandoned office, I was only a thin wall away from safety in the outdoors. It was a bright and sunny day, too, and it helped to calm me down. It was a shame that once I looked back from the window, I saw that the shoe was surrounded by a rust-colored splotch. Curious, I leant down and picked up the shoe, but as I turned it around, I heard a rattle from within and saw a collection of small marbled rocks come tumbling out onto the floor. Most of them scattered away to the dark corners, but one fell into my hand, and it didn't take me long to realize it was actually once a toe. I threw the damn thing away, but damn if it didn't pique my curiosity. I actually kind of wanted to know what the hell was going on and if this place was the source of all those strange rumors and hollow roots. Of course, that place is only one facet of the town and hardly the start of all of its problems. But that's another story, isn't it? What's important right now is that you know what I found elsewhere in that place. Well, in that back room there was an archive, and what I pulled out of there told me they dug up all sorts of strange things. Not just oil and coal, but remains of old marble rock too large for them to haul up out of there. The last few entries made mention of a sonic engineer coming to test his marble for signs of weakness. I inferred that this made reference to the ultrasound. Either way, I kept on going, and past the archives were a load of offices, and even a few primitive computers that had been smashed to hell and back. I'm talking about chairs and the damn plastic work, and a femur in the door of a bathroom stall. A lot of the place was like this. There were splintered bones and destroyed machinery, and a lot of signs of panic, including blood-splattered hands, barricaded offices, and skeletons propped up on top of one another. It just seemed so old at the time that I thought the threat was long gone. Or maybe I just really wanted to know. Anyways, I eventually found the shaft that went down below. It involved walking through a mile of smashed up rooms. The shaft itself was just after a set of communal showers, the sign for which was shredded on the floor and sprayed with blood. I ignored this room and kept walking until I found the actual shaft only meters ahead. Looking down it, I felt a terrible fear rise up in me. Wide as it was, and riddled with machines, I could see that it was a tremendous rip in the face of the earth. More than anything else I had seen before me, that one sight struck me as a genuine threat to my person. I also noticed that near the shaft was a lump of marble they must have pulled up. Jesus Christ, such a thing had never been seen before. It was a cascade of colors that never seemed to stay still, and was radiant even in the dark. Being near it seemed unpleasant, and it emitted an audible hum that didn't seem to get louder or quieter no matter where you stood. To think they'd hauled that up out of the earth was an unsettling thought, and I couldn't help but assume that it was the stone's radiations that made me feel afraid, and not the shaft itself. At the side of the large elevator that descended the shaft was a ladder. Again, I ain't gonna make excuses, so just accept that I was a moron, and that this particular moron went down. A lot of you will have seen me as the big honcho up top, so it might be good for you guys to know that I, too, had been young and stupid. Anyways, by the time I was near the bottom, I could scarcely see the top. It hung up above me like a star in the distance. It helped me feel safe enough to rush the last few rungs. Once I reached the bottom, I was thankful to see that there was a load of torches piled up on the ground, still charged. So I picked one up and shook off the bony hand that still gripped it. When I lit the hallway ahead of me up, I saw several tunnels stretching off into the distance. Most of them I didn't pay attention to. Most of them looked like good old-fashioned mine shafts. But one of them was wrecked with carnage. Shattered metal was embedded in the rock beside skulls and grimy rib cages that were strewn along the tunnel, with what seemed to be near 100 empty overalls, caked in blood and dried viscera. Around about now, I started to realize I'd volunteered to be the victim in a horror film, but when I looked back up, I could see only the darkness. The ladder stretched on for a while, but there was nothing there above it. I panicked and thought I had been trapped by someone above who had covered the entrance. But just as I began to lose control, a draft washed over my face. It didn't take a genius to know which of the several tunnels was beckoning me, and so I went onwards, shuffling around the empty suits and smashed pickaxes, until I came to a point in the tunnel where the walls opened up to reveal a colossal chasm made of that very same stone marble. It was expansive beyond imagination. I could not see another wall or roof in the place except for those that surrounded the arch from which I had emerged. For a moment, I remained fixed on the spot, unsure of what to do when a most peculiar filament rolled down from the darkness above. It lay ahead of me about a foot and dangled precariously at head height while shimmering in the light of my torch. I was transfixed for a moment when I noticed another hanged low beside it. I shone my light upwards and saw that the darkness above was riddled with this complex web of 1,000 strings made visible only by my torch. And then another strange thing happened. In the darkness high above the webbing, I saw a red and smoky shape convulse just beyond the veiled abyss. It seemed almost fluid, but it was also clearly solid. It reminded me of fabric in the ocean, or perhaps like a quivering and billowing drop of velvet red ink dropped into black water. I stared at this mesmerizing fleshy movement when, from further above it, some lights started to glow dimly. Suddenly, they flashed much more brightly, and there was a shimmering symmetrical kaleidoscope of bioluminescence. And it dawned on me that I was staring at some sort of colossal thing, most reminiscent of a jellyfish. It floated up in the air like the entire place was the deep ocean, and I couldn't help but revel in the beauty of it all. This thing was at least 50 meters across, and I could see that its tendrils dangled beneath it while it floated alone in the abyss. It really was beautiful. And then its lights went off, and I could see it no more. For a moment I felt sad, but I pushed this aside to appreciate the glory of what I had seen. It was a most strange but enchanting creature, and the knowledge that such an unknown variable could exist was an awe-inspiring discovery that reaffirmed within me some spiritual hope. I wanted to see it again, but as hard as I tried to reach up with my light, I could only glimpse bits of its red and fleshy underbelly. I breathed a sigh of relief and happiness when, for a moment, I saw the belly flare up and glow faintly like it had before. Once again, it flashed suddenly and revealed itself in a glorious halo. But my feeling of joy lasted only for a moment, for I saw something else in the darkness. A gaping maw and white eyes that possessed no intelligence, but whose cornea bore scratches as thick as my arm. I saw the jellyfish swallowed whole in an instant, and watched the tail of the predatory beast whip past me by no more than 15 feet. It was neither a fish nor a squid, nor really anything anyone would ever have seen before. It just was, well, it was a skittering mess of legs, fins, and teeth that was large enough to dwarf the Empire State Building. And it too lit up to reveal that abyss was colossal, and that it was not alone. It and many others like it and the jellyfish it had just eaten bobbed up and down and swam through the air between the ruins of a city carved from the stone of the floor and the walls. I caught only glimmers of towering turrets with cephalopod tentacles coiled around the base, and of glowing eyes set within the darkness of strange and hollow temples. Each step of each building must have been 30 or 40 meters high, and the buildings themselves were simply too large to make any rational sense. even if their architecture was somehow instinctively familiar. This city was at once classical and modern. There were aqueducts, broken and overgrown with strange and writhing growths, and walkways that crumbled onto the floor below. There were pillars and columned ruins that held images of things I could not quite see. For this, I'm rather thankful, and it all seemed to glisten in that shimmering, luminescent marble. And all of it, every inch of it, was infected with that strange and physics-defying life. I cried with madness and remained there for some time until I found my stomach starting to feel light, like the moment when you dangle over the edge of a roller coaster. I noticed that my coattails rose behind me, and my feet felt like they made less and less contact with the floor beneath me. It was at this moment that I started to sense some sort of impending danger, and used what little traction I had on my surroundings to fling myself back into the mine. As I passed through the air, I grew increasingly weightless, and for a second, I felt like I was floating. But as soon as I crossed the marble arch back into the mine itself, I collapsed with my usual weight. I don't remember much of what followed. Not really. I do have strong memories of reaching the top of the shaft and realizing that the tunnel curved in such a manner that the light above me was obscured when I was below, meaning that I had no need to think I was ever trapped. I also remember struggling through the endless hallways back into the entrance, where I fell through the window near the receptionist desks. I wanted a quick way out, and that seemed to do it. But I don't remember driving home, nor do I remember the date and time of year when I returned. But this was all a long time ago, and it was the first of many other visits in my lifetime. Like I said, Hollow Roots isn't that dangerous of a place. You just need to be careful. Like this story, it will reveal as much as it conceals, and it will never let you feel safe or secure in any meaningful way. Just don't be an idiot like I was, and don't think that the laws of reality will keep you safe. If you're still curious, though, I lost my eye while staying in the Moonlight Inn. Some of its permanent residents have a perverse understanding of the old saying, "It's all fun and games until someone loses an eye." I kept telling them that the saying didn't confer a desired unit of fun. I lost a third of my liver due to alcoholism after my first trip. I know that's cheating, but I feel like it counts. A kidney of mine was borrowed by some rather unpleasant fellows who ran a butcher shop in town, but who were later chased out by unhappy residents. And the 3 meters of intestine? I'll just say that Intra Incorporated hated their tax audits, and that you should never drink the coffee that they give you. The Moonlight Inn. The Moonlight Inn wasn't just old, it was also in a sad state of disrepair. Stella, the night clerk, liked to comment that the name was appropriate. Shadow Hills has always been a beautiful place. A peaceful small town in the middle of the mountains, so quiet and safe that everybody can always leave the door unlocked and sleep with the window open. It's one of those places that's almost so perfect, it seems like out of a movie. Despite not having a big population, the people of Shadow Hills are very close, and most of them have something in common: being united by faith. The people in Shadow Hills share the same beliefs and way of living. However, the people there don't discriminate against people who don't share the same faith. You could take me and my family as an example. My parents do not follow any religion, Neither do I. Yet, we're very included in different activities and, well, we get on just fine with the others. I was born there. My parents moved there when my mom was in her second trimester. They just thought it was a beautiful place to live. And surprisingly, my family and I can make a better living in a small place like Shadow Hills where there aren't any big chains. Unlike in the big cities in California where big chain brands are taking over independent bakeries and other businesses. Ever since I was a small kid, I kinda knew that Shadow Hills was a good place. Everybody knows of each other, and it feels like your neighbors are your family. All of my memories of playing in the street and the forests with my friends and riding our bikes, and of course, pissing off old Jerry Cruz, the old owner of the local general store. One day I was playing outside my house with my friends. Our bakery is located on the first floor of our house. My friends constantly visited me because they knew my mom always gave them muffins and fresh bread. After my mom gave us something to eat, we calmly sat in the garden when a car arrived at the house. Next door. A woman and a child exited the car, grabbing a few suitcases. "They must be moving to the empty house next to you," Dominic, one of my friends, said. And he was right. When my mother noticed that the woman and child were struggling to carry the heavy suitcases, she told my friends and me to go help the woman. And we did as we were told. When we offered to help her, she seemed very shy but very touched by our gesture. After helping, my friends and I introduced ourselves to her and her son, who was very, very quiet. The woman's name was Heather, and her son's name was Valentino. He was 13 years old, just like me. We offered Valentino to come and play with us, if he wanted, but Heather, his mom, politely rejected the offer in his name, saying that he needed to help her unpack. We understood, and so we left. Later on, just before dinner, my mom and I went to the new neighbor's house to take a tart as a welcome gift. When we got there, Heather opened the door and welcomed us. Mom introduced herself and talked a bit with Heather, and I asked Heather if I could go say hi to Valentino. She was hesitant for a second, but then she said yes, and so I got to his room and I asked if I can enter. Valentino, who was organizing his room, looked at me and nodded. I was surprised to see that his room was very simple and dark, not like the room of any other kid. "So, is this your mom's room?" I asked. "No, it's mine," he answered. "Well, where's all your stuff? Where's your toys?" I asked him. "No, I don't have any. What's the point?" he answered. I felt bad asking him that. Maybe he had to leave his toys in his previous house, or maybe his mom didn't have money for toys. I wanted to make things better, so I tried being really nice. "Well, if you want to play with a toy or something, you could come by my house anytime. I got plenty of stuff, a Nintendo Wii, I've got all these G.I. Joes and stuff." I offered to him. Valentino's blue eyes lit up as soon as I said that. But oddly enough, his smile didn't match the emotion his face was showing. He smiled, but for some reason, it made me feel very uneasy. He was very small for his age and extraordinarily skinny. He kind of looked like an old person at the same time as a young person, and his attitude was not that of a child. He sounded and acted more like an adult. His dark hair was perfectly combed to one side, and his clothes were spotless. It might sound strange, but I kind of lost myself analyzing him for a few minutes before Heather came to the room. "Evan, are you okay? We've been calling for you, honey," she said. "Oh, yeah, sorry. I got caught up," I answered. "So is everything all right?" Heather shyly asked. "Oh, yes, Mama. Why wouldn't it be?" Valentino interrupted as he grinned. Now, after he said that, Heather took me downstairs to my mom, who asked me why I wasn't answering her. I said I didn't even hear them, and they explained to me that they had called me 5 times. I found that incredibly odd. You know, looking back, maybe I did get lost analyzing Valentino longer than expected. Before leaving, Mom said to Heather she'd see her at church on Sunday. Now, I know that sounds weird considering I said my family and I are not religious, but every Sunday there was a gathering at the back of the church where almost everybody in town went to share food and talk and just overall socialize. Now, I didn't see Valentino for a few days, that is, until that Sunday. By the time I arrived at the church social room with my parents, Valentino was already there with his mom, as they had been to church and he was sitting with the other kids eating. I said hi to him, and he answered by grinning. I asked my friends why they were eating earlier. They said it's because the pastor began feeling bad, so he had to finish a bit earlier. Now, apparently, at some point during the service, he spaced out while giving a sermon to the public, to the point where someone had to touch his shoulders so that the pastor would snap out of it. After this, he tried to keep going with the sermon, but he explained that he was feeling really weak, almost to the point of fainting, so that he had to leave sooner. Now, while talking about this, I remember looking at Valentino while he had a smirk on his face all along. He noticed I was looking at him, so he stopped. I always felt uneasy seeing Valentino smile. He could be described as a handsome kid, I guess. In fact, people in town said he was kind of a cute kid, but whenever he smiled or smirked, I kind of felt strange. It was so unnatural. After eating, my friends and I went to play outside. Everybody was in the same area, but some of us were sort of doing our own thing. Some were playing tag, while others climbed trees, went into the forest. I was just part of the group that was playing tag, and everything seemed to be going well until we heard a loud bang. One of the boys, Matthew, had fallen from a tree. I didn't look, but he must have fallen pretty high for it to sound that way. When we came to see Matthew, he was bleeding from his head. Some of the kids immediately ran back inside to tell the adults. Matthew's older brother, my friend Donovan, was there holding his hand trying to find his pulse. I'm not sure if he really knew what he was doing, but Matthew looked so bad that we were afraid that he had died. And so when Matthew and Donovan's father arrived, he knew that Matthew was alive. Mr. Arver, the town's doctor, well, he came too and told us to call 911. As Matthew was unresponsive and he was bleeding from his head, things were very serious. We were all asked to leave with the exception of a few people, to give the family privacy and space for the paramedics. On our way home, my parents walked with Heather. They were talking about Matthew's accident. I asked Valentino if he had seen Matthew falling. Valentino then looked at me with his deep blue eyes and said, "Well, yes, of course I did." I couldn't help but to ask, "Well, Valentino, well, how did it happen? Let me know." To which Valentino replied, "Bad. We'll have to see if he survives, right?" I was like, "What the hell, Valentino? I just found this statement so odd." But I thought he might have been in shock after seeing this. I knew some of the other kids were. Later on that night, something strange happened. I was sleeping when I heard a noise coming from downstairs. Of course, I got up and I decided to go and see what it was. As I opened the bakery's door, I saw Valentino stuffing his face with food. Raspberry danishes. When he got caught, he stopped eating and looked at me straight in the eye as his eyes turned red. But before I had the chance to speak, I woke up. Hell, it was the worst nightmare that I had had in a couple of years. The next day when I woke up, I began to wonder why my dream felt so real, and I ran down the stairs while still in my pajamas, and I asked my parents, who were already working, if I could take some fresh bread for Heather and Valentino. And they said yes, of course. And so I knocked on Heather's door. She was surprised to see me. I gave her the bread and asked if everything was okay in her house. Heather always looked kind of scared and fragile, but when I asked her that, she acted way weirder than normal. She said they were okay, but her eyes, about to tear up, said otherwise, as if she wanted to tell me something that she couldn't. I left after she answered, but I just wasn't content. Part of me felt that I was overreacting, but the other part of me felt that worse things were yet to come. And I was right. And so everything was relatively calm for a week. I mean, Matthew was still in the hospital in town, and Pastor was still feeling odd after the Sunday sermon. But everything else was okay. But one day, after school, my friends and I, including Valentino, who now went to our school, we went out playing in the woods. As we were on our way, my friend Lawson asked Valentino about his father. "Hey, do you have a dad? I never see him around," Lawson had asked him. "Well, of course," Valentino replied. "Well, I mean, how is he? What does he do?" Lawson curiously asked him. "Oh, he's great. Although he's away, we constantly speak," he replied. "Oh, cool. Well, when will we meet him?" Lawson had asked. "Once everything's ready for him," Valentino replied as he smiled. I wanted to jump into the conversation and ask what that meant, but by the time I was going to speak, we were already in the woods, and my friends had rushed on their bikes. Now, everybody loved going downhill with their bikes. I mean, that's what we constantly did. We were so used to the woods, the mountains, and our mountain bikes. And that's why I found it strange when Lawson began struggling. "My brakes!" he screamed as he wasn't able to stop his bike on time and hit a tree. All of us ran down to Lawson, just to find that his arm was clearly broken. It was just dangling there. We checked his bike and it seemed to be okay, but he swore for a moment that he lost total control of it. Nothing had worked. When he said this, I looked around and noticed all of us were there with him, except for Valentino, who was uphill looking at us with a very seriously stern face. Now, if I had had a bad feeling before all this, well, it intensified at that moment. I knew some way or another that Valentino had something to do with it. And so after we took Lawson to his house, which was quite the struggle, by the way, he passed out a couple of times, his arm was flopping around my shoulder. But everybody else went home. I had to walk my way with Valentino, which made me feel very uneasy. I tried to walk fast, but he was walking slowly. "Are you in a hurry?" he calmly asked me. I didn't want him to completely know how I felt, so I just told him that I needed to go back and help my parents with the bakery. "I love the danishes that your parents bake," he said. I think I then said something along the lines of, "Well, you can eat whatever you want," to try to appear friendly. Once we were around the corner of our houses, I saw my dad outside. So as I said goodbye, I ran towards my father. We were eating dinner that night, and I asked Mom if she knew about Valentino's father. but she explained that Heather is a single mom, and that Valentino's father was not present in their lives. Now, this was completely opposite to what Valentino said, and at that moment I knew for sure I had to try to dig for more information. And so later on I was in bed, not completely asleep, when I heard a noise downstairs. I got up from my bed and went down to the bakery. As I opened the door, two red eyes met mine in the dark, and it was no other than Valentino. I stood still, thinking it might be a dream, as I saw him eating raspberry danishes. I slapped my face and noticed I wasn't dreaming, and so I talked to him. "Valentino, what are you doing here?" I asked. "Well, you told me to come here whenever I wanted." He answered using an unusual voice. Well, I felt scared. I was trying to understand why his eyes looked so different, but next thing I knew, I was completely hypnotized by them. I stood still for who knows how long until my dad came downstairs and saw me standing by the bakery's door. My dad screamed at me and told me off for eating all the raspberry danishes. I said it wasn't me, but he didn't believe me. And I told him it had been Valentino who had sneaked in, but there was no signs that he had broken it. And so the next day at school, I felt uneasy as I could feel. Valentino constantly staring at me. But I still pretended things were, well, that they were okay. And at school, I heard from Dominic that Donovan and Matthew were back. My friends suggested for us to visit them the next day. However, I was in a rush. I needed to speak to Matthew about his accident. So without telling anybody, I went to their house after school. Donovan opened the door and was surprised to hear that I wanted to talk to his younger brother. And Donovan explained to me that Matthew didn't remember what had happened, and that he's feeling very confused and he's saying things that don't make any sense. But I insisted for him to let me speak to his brother, till he accepted. And so I went to Matthew's room. I said hi to him, and then asked him if it was okay for him to tell me what had happened. Matthew was shy and didn't want to talk, but when I told him it was important and explained that Lawson had been hurt in a strange bike accident, he looked at Donovan and asked his brother to leave the room. We were alone, and Matthew told me that while he was climbing the tree that day, he looked around to check on the others when his eyes met the new boy, Valentino. He claims that when he looked at Valentino, he felt hypnotized as if he couldn't think straight anymore. Then, all of a sudden, a voice in his head told him to throw himself from the tree. He didn't want to, but this voice was powerful and mind-numbing. It was almost controlling his actions, against his wishes. He ended up dropping completely by himself. Now, upon learning this, I felt so bad for little Matthew, but I was relieved that I was right and that there was something off about Valentino. Matthew and I had come to the agreement we would do whatever it takes to unmask him and make sure people in town know about it and are safe again. After leaving Matthew's house, I went back to my own. When I got there, my mom told me my friends had come over to invite me to the woods about 30 minutes ago. I'd asked her if Valentino was with them. She said yes, and I knew this was the perfect time. So I told my mom I was going to play with my friends. But, in reality, I went over next door to Heather's. So, Heather opened the door, and she was surprised as all hell to see me. I was honest with her and told her I knew something was up with her son. Heather seemed just so afraid and tried to deny it at first. But I insisted, telling her I knew he was behind all the bad things happening in town. and that's when Heather broke out into tears. Once she was through about a half a box of tissues, I asked her how Valentino could be related to what's happening in Shadow Hills. Heather thanked me for wanting to help, but just claimed that I was too young to understand. Now, seeing that I wouldn't take no for an answer, she told me to sit up as she grabbed a folder that was hidden in between some knitting boxes. She then handed me the folder. When I opened it, there were newspaper articles of things that had been happening in different towns over the last 7 years. Things very similar to what was happening in Shadow Hills. People having strange accidents. Even things such as death and fires. I asked her what this all meant. She then explained to me that those were all the towns where she and Valentino previously lived. It wasn't weird for me to hear that Valentino had done all those things, but I couldn't understand how he did some of those things when he was just 6 or 7. I mean, after all, how could a child do all of that? But Heather revealed to me the truth, that although it's hard to believe, that it's not impossible. Heather used to live in a house away from everything growing up. She was part of a large religious family who also lived deep in the mountains. However, her parents were very strict and didn't let their kids have contact with the outside world. One day, there was a handsome middle-aged man who came to their house. And although her father hardly ever allowed visitors, there was something about the man who made him change his opinion. And so, he allowed the man to stay. Now, a few days after staying, Heather said a voice inside of her told her that she had to be intimate with the man. And deep down, Heather thought and kind of knew it was wrong. She claimed she felt something inside of her pushing her to do so. And so, Heather stayed with the man. I thought it was strange she was telling me all this. I mean, I was only 13 at the time, but anyway, I digress. But while she was with him, his appearance changed. He no longer looked handsome. Hell, he didn't even look human. His skin turned dark red, black eyes with very white pupils. He lost his hair, and tiny little spikes protruded from his back. The whole time Heather was telling me this, I thought she was insane. And so, after everything was said and done, so to speak, Heather passed out until the next morning. When she woke up, there were no signs of the man. She asked her family about the man's whereabouts, and they said, "What man? There was no man here." Heather was upset, but didn't mention anything else due to shame. She also tried to avoid thinking about the thing that she saw when she was with him, and tried to convince herself it was only a hallucination, a bad dream, or perhaps even a nightmare. However, a couple of months later, Heather and her family realized she was pregnant. Although the family was very upset, they allowed Heather to continue living with them. And Heather gave birth to Valentino and lived with them on the farm for 5 years. But the day that Valentino turned 6, everything changed. There was one day where Heather left the property to go and collect wood. But when she came back, she noticed that the farmhouse and the barns were completely on fire, and screams from her dying family could be heard. But it was too late to save them. The most disturbing part was that Valentino was standing in front of the burning house with a smile on his face and holding a box of matches. Heather refused to acknowledge that this was on purpose and thought it was only coincidence or perhaps even an accident. She then escaped, but everywhere she went, tragic things happened. Funnily enough, Valentino was always at the place where these things had happened. Whenever Heather tried to confront him, Valentino hypnotized her just like he did with me and Matthew, making her lose track of time. Heather also claims that she sometimes hears Valentino talking with someone in the middle of the night. And in tears, Heather admitted she thinks her son is not from this realm. Now for me, well, I guess at first it was hard to believe, but a lot of things made sense. The black eyes, the hypnotizing, controlling people's minds. Plus, I've seen enough to know she wasn't making any of it up. I asked her if there was any way to stop this, but she said the only way to stop it was if Valentino didn't realize it. I promised Heather I would help her one way or another before I left her house. And so, I left Heather's house. And I realized maybe the best thing to do was to talk to the pastor. And so I headed to his house. But once there, his wife said that he was still ill. And so I wasn't allowed to go in. But I was desperate, and I didn't know what to do. And this is when I decided to sneak into the church to try to get some answers. The doors to the church were already open, and as I was heading to the church's library, someone had talked to me. "Looking for ways to get rid of me, Evan?" the voice said. I turned back to see Valentino standing a few meters away from me. His eyes were black. "I'm not doing anything. I'm just trying to get some books," I tried to explain while I remembered Heather's words. The only way to get rid of him is if he doesn't expect it. Which means I was screwed. "You're curious, aren't you? I assume you know everything," Valentino said as his innocent voice changed into a more mature voice. At that moment, I was very afraid. "You're not going to get away. You see, I'm not the only one in town who knows who you are." Valentino was furious after I said this. Unexpectedly, his appearance rapidly changed. Dark red skin, black eyes, almost exactly as Heather described Valentino's father, minus the spiky things coming out of his back, and still with hair in a human shape. I tried to run away the moment I saw that, but quickly after this, Valentino ran towards me, grabbed me, and then pushed me to the podium where the pastor speaks. He stood there in front of me, and I looked up and noticed that he had a box of matches. He was going to try to burn the church with me still inside. But all of a sudden, everything changed, and I heard a couple of shots being fired. For a moment, I closed my eyes thinking that I had been shot. But then I heard Lawson, Donovan, Matthew, and Dominic calling my name and telling me to run to them. I opened my eyes and I saw Valentino, now in his human form, laying on the floor, bleeding out. He looked like he was hurt. Hell, he looked like he was dead. I stood up and ran towards my friends, but before that, I grabbed the box of matches out of Valentino's hand. My friends and I then ran out of the church while we were still keeping an eye on him, who was trying to crawl, fighting for his life, blood gushing out of his body. We noticed that there was a gasoline smell, which meant that Valentino had already poured gasoline all around the church. I don't know why I didn't notice it earlier. I told my friends to back off, and then we proceeded to light a couple of matches to set the fuel on fire. We sat and stared for a minute as the church slowly went up in flames. And then all of a sudden, the church completely burst into flames. And at that moment, a screech could be heard all over town as Valentino burned. This is when people got out of their homes and noticed what was happening. My friends and I ran into the woods so we couldn't be seen. Donovan snuck to his house and put his father's gun back in its place. And I just remember being so lucky they had decided to follow Valentino that day, after Matthew managed to convince Donovan there was something strange about him. People came to try to help extinguish the fire, and our firefighters tried their best too. but it was too late for the church in Valentino. And that's when people started asking questions. My friends and I said we've heard Valentino saying he wanted to pull a prank by setting a small fire in the church. And Heather backed us up, saying that he had been problematic, tried to do something similar before. And this stopped any further investigation from happening. Some people said that they had heard shots, but we're so deep into the woods that it was probably the hunters hunting. After that night, everything was normal again. The pastor got better. No other kids or adults were hurt, and the church was eventually reconstructed, and Shadow Hills was back to normal. Heather decided to stay in town and married one of the pastor's sons, and she told him the truth. But only my friends, Heather and her husband, and I, know the truth. And this all happened many years ago, but, sometimes I wonder if Valentino's father managed to have any more children. And if so, are they trying to hurt people too? I hope we never experience anything like this again. But I feel insecure knowing there might be more Valentinos around the world. I've discovered a horrifying truth. That now extinction may be the best hope we have. I know it sounds crazy, and yes, the things I now know may be too much for our species to grasp. While the effects of your mind shattering might ultimately serve humanity's greater interests, I suppose the parts of me that remain human still possess some morbid, misplaced sympathy for the ignorant. After all, I've lived countless lifetimes blissfully unaware that we, as a species, are trapped. Not quite dead, but doomed in a purgatory-like state that, unless we intervene, will persist until all the stars in the sky go dim, and perhaps even beyond. Even so, this is the only reality we've ever known. And I can't help but understand those who'd simply prefer not to know. I only pray that our jailer doesn't realize what I've done here. For all I know, it could simply unmake every bit of progress I've suffered for, or even alter my memories and turn me back into one of the blissfully unaware meat puppets to which humanity has been reduced. I've eluded discovery so far. I just need to make enough people aware so that we can do something to change our fate. Well, if you're still here, you're either ready for the truth, or I'm about to break another mind. Last chance to turn back. Life in 2020. That's where we are now, right? Humanity is the same as ever, warring for ridiculous reasons, pushing the envelope with new technologies, and overall trying to find a purpose in our otherwise dull and uninteresting lives. I had cursed the daily slog, getting up every morning to trudge my way to my dead-end job and secretly hoped that some great stroke of misfortune would strike my workplace and render it inaccessible. Well, at least for a week or two. A gas leak or some huge mess. Or hell, a meteorite the size of a football crashing through the walk-in freezer. Something ridiculous like that. Knowing what I do now, the tedium of lower-middle-class American life seems hopeful, ideal even, compared to the truth. It was at this point that I first became aware, at least, when I first began to peel back the layers of the veil of lies which composes our entire perception of the world around us. I was walking to work one morning, across the road in what I like to call mid-rural Florida. It wasn't all farmland and hillbillies, but the nearest Walmart was a good 15 minutes away, a sleepy town at the edge of the suburbs. But before you hit the trailer parks, creepy farmhouses, and swamps. Still, quiet as it was, some things were the same no matter where you went. Maybe he'd been driving too fast for me to realize he was coming. Or perhaps I'd simply fallen so deeply into the motions of the daily grind that I just mechanically wandered into the crosswalk without even looking. Neither determination would have changed the outcome as the dark-colored SUV plowed into my soft, frail human body. You know, it's true what they say. When you come close to death, everything just stops. For a moment, I even thought the driver had slammed on his brakes and barely nudged me. But the sensation of the life slowly draining away from my swiftly breaking body made it all too real. That was what dying felt like. I caught the driver's eye in the split second we shared during that final moment of my life. Terror flashed across his gaze, as I'm sure it did mine, before the light drained from the world, and all sensation, except for the dullest, most disconcertingly muted thud of impact left my perception. Dead on impact, I'm sure the autopsy would have said. Barely enough time to even register the pain. This is it, I remember thinking now, though at the time I was surprised I still had such a capacity for thought. Bring the pearly gates or the fiery abyss. Nothing stopping it now. I'd never been a religious man. Perhaps that's what ultimately kept me sane through this whole ordeal. For just a moment, I became aware of something. Sensation, movement. Not like someone was hefting my unmoving corpse onto a stretcher or anything. This was manual limb control. Locomotion. My arms, my legs. But I wasn't in control. Everything was dark, and there was only a faint clattering sound, like needles tapping on glass. Discontinuity followed, and as far as I was aware, I was alive again. Only I wasn't me. And I wasn't actually aware of anything that just plowed my awareness from my mangled corpse into a new working body. I was, well, let me stop there before I get hung up on who I actually am, or was, for that matter. It'll be irrelevant before long anyway. All you need to know is that I was reincarnated. We all are, it seems, but not in a manner you've come to expect. I wasn't reborn so much as I was inserted into another body roughly the same age as my past self. New identity, new memories, new me. Completely seamless without any knowledge of what had just happened. At least, at first. Life carried on like I'd never met my end at the business end of a speeding motor vehicle. And my existence on the complete opposite end of the world seemed as normal as ever. Until, of course, humanity exemplified both its lust for destruction and its unerring frailty once again. My next death came at the hands of a homeless man on the streets of Moscow. He'd asked for change that I simply didn't have, and responded with an empty bottle of vodka to the back of my head when I relayed this to him. Once again, curtains of darkness drew over the world, and I became distinctly aware of being someplace other than the cold, snowy streets of Russia. Even more perplexing, I remembered the car accident. Every little detail of the wreck that had claimed my previous life was as fresh as if it had just occurred. Before I could even think to puzzle over this, I felt this dark world slip away, but not before I heard the odd clattering sound again. I went through many lives after that, in many places. Africa, Asia, back in the US. I could barely remember most of them. It seems like only violent deaths can bring me back to that horrible place beyond the terminus of life. But through it all, I began to piece some things together, and the dark world that lingered in my perception after death became more clear. After a particularly gruesome death courtesy of a pair of wild dogs in Australia. I, of course, returned to the world beyond. Only this time, something had changed. I could see. For the first time, whatever passed my eyes in this body of mine could sense the world around me. Now, I couldn't control where I looked, nor did I recognize the dark amber walls surrounding me, but I could finally see just where I went after each bloody death. I could tell it was dark, but my eyes were accustomed to it, perhaps built for low-light environments. I could also move, but I was not in control of my motions. At this point, I was a prisoner in this body, peering out through alien windows as whatever contained my consciousness moved about these dark, yellow-orange tunnels. The walls themselves looked almost organic. Chitinous or resinous, maybe. Slightly shiny, like they were wet. I couldn't feel anything, but once again I heard the tapping, tinking, and clattering sound. I heard it in the distance and very close every time my body walked. The surreal experience lasted maybe 15 minutes, providing a short-lived tour through the strange alien tunnels, before I was pulled from purgatory and back into life. Now again, my recollection of this place stopped until my next bloody death. And again, my perception of it grew stronger, and continued to do so each time my life came to an abrupt and violent end. I can't remember how many times I'd gone through the cycle before the bombshell of dreadful, horrible truth descended upon my mind and mangled my perception of life, existence, and the universe as a whole. I can't even recall how I died that time. I think the trauma of finding out where I went with each death took that knowledge wherever it took my sanity. For all the times I'd been to this place, I'd never seen another living soul, never spotted what made that strange clattering sound, and still had no idea what kind of body I had, if I even had one at all. For all I knew, I was just a soul in a jar being carried around by a demon, and this place was hell. I mean, really, that would have been preferable. The biblical hell was all fire, brimstone, and suffering. But at least you knew what you had, what you were. No one could have imagined this. No human mind in that pathetically Luddite area of our history could have conceived of the things I now know. And if they had, I'm sure they would have killed themselves to ensure they never met this fate. I was walking alone. Well, being walked, I should say, as I still had no control over my limbs, and eventually came to a part of the world beyond. The tunnels opened into an enormous antechamber, where what appeared to be translucent pods made of rough glass or resin lined the towering walls. It was here that I finally saw them, the denizens of this horrible place. Huge, vaguely insectoid and pale. Vestigial wings hung limp from their back, and 4 spindly legs arched upwards and crawled down from a body that could only be described as a centaur of Greek myth, but all chitin. 4 arms tipped with grasping claws, and a vaguely wasp-like head, complete with twitching antennae. I tried to scream, but my lips either refused to move or simply did not exist. Looking back, I don't know what good it would have done. I just couldn't think of anything else but to vocalize the horror of what unfolded before my eyes. The bug things were lowering the resin tubes off the walls, their needle-like legs piercing into the wall and allowing them to scale up the sheer amber surface. And here, the clicking and tapping sound was at its loudest, and I realized now what it was. The tapping of their feet against the resinous floors and walls. And there must have been thousands of them in these caverns. Panic rose in the phantom space that might have been my heart, as I was made to approach the wall, up close, The things were just as pale and grotesque as anything else you'd expect to find in a near lightless environment. There had to be a dozen in the room right now, some coming and going as they worked to peel open the tubes and retrieve some unseen treasure from inside. Many of the bugs appeared to be injured or damaged in some way, their carapaces pocketed with holes, some missing entire limbs. Whatever the cause, they appeared entirely unconcerned with their wounds. I stopped at the foot of the wall. I suppose I should have put two and two together by this point, but my mind refused to accept the theory stringing together in my mind. I watched the bug thing higher on the wall pass a tube down to a lower one, then one even lower, then to me. 4 chitinous graspers took a hold of the tube and, with unimaginable strength, hauled it aside and set it down. My mind spun as I witnessed the hands, the ones attached to his body from which I viewed this terrible world, tear into the resinous membrane at the front of the tube. Only when my body tilted forward so it could view its own handiwork did I finally realize the truth. Large, compound eyes, wasp-like face complete with antennae, sharp, pincered mandibles. This was me. My face, my body, my hands, my prison. I think the shock of my realization awakened me to something. A sensation began to creep into my horrible, clawed extremities. I begged for it to go away, to retreat into the recesses of whatever veil had held it back. This couldn't be me. I was a human being. This was all some horrible pre-death nightmare that only seemed quite so long because of the time distortion we experienced in dreams. My death at the intersection was my only true death, and I was just dreaming the rest of this. Just dreaming. But the sensation persisted. No veil of darkness swept the world away, and no beam of light carried me to the heavens and away from this hellish world. I watched helplessly as the resin glass was torn away, and a dazed but otherwise seemingly unharmed human came into view. The clawed hands, which I refused to call my own, made quick work of that, piercing into the man's carotid artery, producing a spray of blood and gurgling sound I had previously figured exaggerated for gory movies. It tore into that body, dissecting flesh and bone with its powerful claws, ripping viscera apart and completely dismembering the human corpse. The sensation of human body parts squishing under my fingers made me want to vomit into the ethereal void that was my existence. Other workers approached and began to cart the mess of organs, limbs, and tissues away. My body carefully took the head in its hands, its claws effortlessly snapping off the jaw, ripping flesh from bone, and cracking the skull in just the right way to remove the intact prize waiting within. The brain. It discarded the rest of the head, tossing the remnants into the open chest cavity of its victims, which another drone casually hefted into its impossibly powerful arms and began to cart away to places unknown. At this point, the darkness began to return. Despite my terror, I fought against it, clawed at the awareness of this world, desperate and horrified to know where this hellish rabbit hole went. I think something broke that time, something in the system of life and death, as it has been for humanity for, God, I don't even know how long now. I awoke to a new life, a flood of memories threatening to overtake me. A woman sat across from me at the table, and 2 children looked on vacantly. I nearly choked on the pasta in my mouth, and some words were sputtered out in apology. In Swedish, I think, but I can't tell. No one looked at me. I hastily excused myself and stumbled upstairs, toward what I vaguely recognized as my bedroom. The tunnels, the bug things, I could still remember them.
even now. Death brought me back there, so to find out what happened, I needed to die. And it couldn't be clean either. I dug through a drawer and found a large pocket knife. My mind raced. What the hell was I going to do? Yes, I had to know the truth, no matter how horrifying, but at what cost? Through the haze of broken, disjointed memories half inserted into my addled brain, I realized that the woman downstairs must have been my wife. And those children. Oh God, I couldn't even think of it. It wouldn't just be my life I was destroying. And as I struggled to make my decision, however, I realized something. They hadn't reacted at all when I'd stormed off from the table. None of them had even looked at me. I went back downstairs and peered around the corner. They were still at the table, my wife and 2 kids, mechanically forking noodles into their mouths. There was something horribly inhuman about the way they ate. I called out to my wife, but she didn't answer. I yelled to her this time. Still nothing. What the hell was going on? More fascinated than concerned, I hurried into the kitchen and smacked one of the kids in the back of the head. He didn't even flinch. He just kept eating. When I slid his plates away, he just reached his arm out farther for it. Not a single one appeared to realize I was there. And I'd seen enough. Whatever this was, it sure as hell wasn't the answers I sought. I brought the knife to my throat, held my breath, and did the deed. The pain surging through me as the blade pierced my carotid artery distracted me from the compulsion to stay in this place, to embrace the lie and forget the horrors I'd seen. But I couldn't. I had to go back to the truth, see where it all wound up. It didn't take long for me to bleed out. Sure enough, my consciousness returned to the inside of the wasp thing in the tunnels. It had made its way to another part of the structure, to what I could best describe as the end of an assembly line. Hundreds of fresh new workers, free of any blemishes or wounds, sat lined up on the floor, their bodies rising and falling with their respirations, but otherwise inert. My organic prison skittered toward the nearest drone, and, grasping the human brain in one hand, took a hold of the new drone's head and pried open the back plate of its chitinous exoskeleton. The damn thing had a hollow head, save for the end of a spinal column. My hands carefully maneuvered the fresh brain into the drone's head, setting it atop the spine. Another hand went to my mouth, where a glob of sickly gray-green mucus was coughed up. The taste brought on another phantom gag reflex, and I couldn't even begin to describe it. This disgusting snot ball was slathered around the base of the brain and spine, and the new drone's head was closed up. Its body twitched a couple of times, then went full-on grand mal for a half a minute. All the drones in the room stopped, but I hardly even noticed. The psychic scream ringing in my head was enough to drive me teetering back to the realm of the living. But I somehow managed to hang on just long enough to endure it. God, I wish I hadn't. Memories flashed before my eyes. School children, homework, a first kiss maybe, first job, a funeral, then a black sky. Military air raid siren, followed by the deafening rumble and blinding light of mother of all bombs colliding with it, our jailer. I woke in a human body once again. Just like last time, I was thrust into a brand new life, already in progress. Now, however, I didn't have to fight away the memories. They came, and they found their place, but they were foreign, irrelevant. The truth had firmly burned itself into my real brain, the one sitting in the once vacant skull of a mass-produced drone, birthed by an entity humanity never had any hope of defeating. The woman who must have been my wife shifted and turned toward me in our bed. She asked me what was wrong, and I responded effortlessly to her in French, telling her I was fine. She hummed sleepily and turned back over, apparently content. Her name was Emily. We had 2 children, Jean and Camille. I was a successful software engineer, and she was a school teacher. All things considered, this wouldn't be a bad life to live. I could forget about everything I'd seen and just continue on in ignorance. Hell, at least she realized I existed, unlike the Swedish woman. I could start over like this. But only I couldn't. This life wasn't real. Nothing past January 4th of 2020 was real. I remembered it all now, my last, or rather my only true death. NASA and the ESA had co-discovered the anomaly in '02, an absolutely massive patch of dark space slowly edging across the sky. It couldn't be seen by anything but the most powerful telescopes of the time, and it was nowhere near us, or so we figured. This curiosity turned nightmarish, as one day the shadow completely vanished, only to be discovered around 3,000 light-years away from its original location. Not only that, but it had gotten closer. This continued for the next 8 years. The shadow would travel to some seemingly random place in space, only to disappear and reappear again. Each time, it drew nearer. Each new discovery raised more and more alarm among the scientists studying the phenomenon, and word eventually got out that something big was headed our way. We still couldn't see what it was, of course. Space is dark, and it was still outside our solar system, unlit by any of our stellar neighbors. Even if light had reached it, we simply didn't have the technology to properly image it. It wouldn't have mattered anyway. All of the world's combined arsenals, nuclear and otherwise, would have dented this thing at best. We knew it, too, when it finally appeared at the edge of the solar system. Its vaguely circular body is surrounded by pale, fleshy tendrils and jagged, rocky-looking flesh. If this thing wanted to kill us, it wouldn't have to try hard. Best estimates put the thing at just over 50,000 kilometers across, about 5 times planet Earth's diameter, give or take. Yet, despite its immense size, it seemed to have no gravitational effect on the bodies around it. It passed right through Pluto without flinching the tiny non-planet into the depths of space, nor did it appear at all disturbed by Jupiter's immense pull. This tendril-covered pseudo-planet spat in the face of gravity, and single-mindedly floated towards its destination, Earth. Panic the likes of which no disaster movie could depict soon ensued. The approaching entity had done nothing to prompt any feeling of dread. It hadn't fired any weapons, shown any aggression, or so much as nudge another planetary body on its way here. But humans are flighty creatures at the best of times. People acted like the end was already upon us, pouring into churches, murdering those who'd wronged them in some final acts of revenge, and fleeing the resulting carnage and chaos, or committing suicide en masse. Those who died before our jailer's arrival were the lucky ones, at least if their brains were destroyed in the process. I don't think it can use broken ones. I remember the day so vividly now. It's as if the newly activated drone seizing had reawakened in my mind, some side effect of the hive mind that keeps them running, combined with the final desperate cries of the fleshy implanted brain before its awareness was suppressed. Its consciousness